I don't know how we're going to change it from this conversation, but I hope some people listen and they do some good things. Today, we're going to discuss how this year of change and increased dialogue around race has affected an amazing group of creators, their lives, and the industry spaces around them.
Born in Sweden to Indian and Canadian parents.
I'm from New York originally. My parents are from Puerto Rico.
Third generation Windrush, so born in London, but spent a lot of my childhood in the Caribbean.
I was born in London. My parents are from Hong Kong.
Everyone's background's quite mixed, whether it's, the actual heritages of your parents, but also places that you lived.
I grew up above a Chinese takeaway, which my parents owned. Fashion was just not in our world whatsoever. And I never really saw it in kind of mainstream publishing. It was very much this image of girls and their grandma's Chanel jackets. And that just wasn't my world. I grew up in Camden, but Camden was very much about kind of personal style and personal sense of expression. So I kind of veered more towards that rather than the mainstream fashion world. And therefore I carved out my own space.
When I started going out, when I was about 14, I became really enthralled with that world, specifically with art and sort of the underground scene that was happening in New York at the time. And through that, I met people like Shane and Telfar, and, they sort of really changed my perspective of what my life could be, because I came from Queens and I come from quite a working class background where everyone has jobs, quite serious jobs. And I always thought that would probably be the direction I went in. And when I met these guys and sort of was exposed to that world and realizing that you actually could make money and live a really fulfilled life by just making stuff, I was hooked. And when I sort of started to explore fashion, real fashion with a capital F, I went to work at W as an internship, and I went on to intern at Vogue and places like that. I realized actually, oh shit, there's no one that looks like me in fashion for real. When I decided I wanted to be a stylist, the only person whose trajectory I think felt similar to what I aspired to was Edward, who again felt very different from me. I was a young kid from Queens, very queer, very street, and he was not. And so I quickly realized, or I felt at the time, that in order to be successful, I would sort of need to assume a certain persona. And I did. And I was, quite good at it because I rose the ranks pretty fast and ended up in London at Love, working for Joe McKenna, all the things that at the time I thought were the right moves to make. It wasn't until I went out on my own. And, we're now fast forward 10, 12 years, and Shane Oliver is now, Shane Oliver, and all the people that I surrounded myself as a kid were now the people who were leading thoughts in this big industry. And I realized, hang on a second, I can be myself, I should be myself, and I'm doing myself a disservice by not sort of tapping into what makes me me.
Both you and Susie, you had to carve out your own either individual community, or you became a part of a community that wasn't reflected back in mainstream fashion. Sam, does that resonate with you? How did you feel when you were starting to come in this industry?
So I'm fortunate because, again, we didn't come from any money or anything like that, as most people here. But my household was really quite educated. So my father went to CSM and did fine art and specialized in stained glass painting. My father and my mother clearly wanted me to go into the arts or into design or into some form of creativity. On the other front, as Susie kind of highlighted, class in this country is a real determinant factor in terms of what you're exposed to. So this idea of fashion didn't really exist. Especially when you're outside of a capital city, you don't really have the access to it, but we had style. So culturally, again, Caribbean background and heritage, there was a strong sense of style. Converses, string vests, nylon pants if you were going up north, which is more part of the casuals culture. And obviously the casuals, working class kids up there, were also mixing with the working class kids from the Caribbean, because we were all growing up in the same speculative hoods or ghettos or whatever. So there was this exchange of what it meant to be from our area and have a sense of style, but it wasn't necessarily fashion. fashion for me only came about quite late. It was only really what was anchored on TV, on MTV, or picking up Dazed, or picking up ID in like a newsagents. That was a portal. It was only when I kind of left the area and went to university to do graphic design and product design that my mind was just opened to all of these different opinions and perspectives on visual communication, self-expression, different communities who had used different materials and fabrics and proportions to kind of echo some type of value.
You mentioning MTV and newsagents really speaks to me. I know when I was a kid, I was obsessed with MTV Base, and actually my granddad on my Indian side owned a newsagent, and that was where I sort of used to spend my Saturdays reading magazines back to front. And so speaking of Indian sides, I know that Ben, you've got some Indian heritage, and I wonder, I don't know whether you had any pushback when you were saying to that side of your family you wanted to be in the creative industry. And
I grew up with, only my mother and my sister, and my mother was extremely important, role model and character in terms of, working hard at things, and also kind of instilled this idea that that we could learn stuff, whatever we wanted. But she was also a single mother, working 2 jobs and raising 2 kids. So I think, and the first, kind of half of my life, I was an athlete. So I grew up, playing basketball and chasing the dream of playing in the NBA. And so I was very, singular in my approach, completely dedicated to this one thing. And my only relationship to fashion was, to Samuel's point, was style, is what we called style. And much of that was, was cultural references from hip hop and New York and Toronto and the places I grew up. So it was much more about self-expression than maybe even trend or industry at the time. And it wasn't until I founded Byredo 15 years ago that I started to understand what fashion was in its then form, because Byredo was primarily a beauty brand that was borrowing sensibility from fashion and art, but I was never directly operating within the system of fashion. So even at that level, where it was quite excluding as a culture, I didn't have to conform. It allowed us to create a very authentic narrative that was, truly subjective and related to myself and to my background, which is, diverse, not only in its ethnicity, but moving and living and within several different cultures and places. I think I developed a level of adaptation, early in life. So Byredo kind of became this vehicle for me to express all those multiple facets of how I saw myself and culture as a whole.
For all its faults, social media has definitely given space for people to connect and have stories that aren't in the main narrative. I know that on my own social media channels, I get messages from people a lot when I've done a project that they're really touching, but they're people that really resonate with it. They don't see themselves reflected back. And I guess that's an interesting point, because Susie, when you started, you did create your own Counterworld as a self-publisher. And when you did that, when you first started, was your heritage and your background something that you were comfortable to push, or I guess, or not?
Yeah, very classic, unfortunate classic model minority myth, which isn't a myth in our family, is that we were taught to assimilate. My family are very connected to, we only speak Cantonese at home, for instance. We are very connected to our culture, but I think we were taught in an outside professional sphere to put that aside and to just get on with it and almost succeed at all costs, which I'm actually now only realizing the kind of the damaging ramifications of that. considering also because I have a child now as well. So for me, it was that beginning of coming into self-publishing and really trying to carve this space, and try and kind of do things like a different way. I was like starting to see like very early on that the industry wasn't going to be like just concentrated in these like very elite bubbles in these 4 cities. So to that end, my focus was always on like championing global talent, independent talent, like from all around the world. And I was like going to like, I don't know, Bangkok Fashion Week, like just going to like places like very early on. Like this was like 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And just sort of seeing like how fashion was becoming this very like kind of globalized thing. And now you really see it obviously through social media, and everyone can have their space. And in that respect, I think that was maybe coming from not seeing myself in mainstream media, and therefore hopefully giving voice or platforms to people who also didn't see themselves.
Social media is becoming more and more good for that. I think especially in the last year that I've seen so many resources like shared, whether it's about Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, trans rights, everything. I feel like it's almost become this tool and place of like community. But that's something I find is on social media. So when we go back to talking about companies, and maybe not our own companies, or when you started, Carlos, when you were starting out in the industry and you were getting your first jobs in magazines, did you find that you were the only person in the room that had a background that wasn't white, or did you find yourself feeling comfortable? How did you feel back in the start of your career?
Similarly to Susie, when I entered into the fashion workforce, that was the first time in my life that I was sort of faced with being the only other. That was never a factor in my real life. I came from New York, where you just sort of existed amongst such a varied group of people, and that was the beauty of it. Perhaps naively, racism or professional segregation or things like that were never things that I necessarily considered. Even as I said, starting out, being surrounded by fashion and art people, it was always a sort of multicultural group. So when I started working at Condé Nast, first in New York, and then I moved to London to work at Love, I was kind of shocked, at the lack of diversity, and it was very challenging to navigate in the beginning. I think when I moved to London, working at Love, actually I met two people who became really close friends of mine. One is Julia Sarjamois, and one is Jeannie Anand Lewin, and they were there, and so that was sort of encouraging. And I think in London, at that particular time, I mean, we're talking like, I'm 33 now, I was 21. So, we're talking quite a while ago. Fashion still had 2 very distinct sort of sides. There was the glossy sort of Condé-ish, uptown, polished side. And then there was like the underground Daisy style mag, like dirty, staying out or all night sort of sides. And I was introduced to that Love Days ID crew. And I thought, right, okay, there is space here to be yourself, and there is space here for individuality. And I think to Susie's point, those 2 worlds have sort of collided in a way where now we're all like sharing the same talent pool and sort of similar points of view and ways of running our businesses. And so that changed a lot. But when we first started, it wasn't like that. And in sort of mainstream fashion, whatever that means, it wasn't sort of cool to be the other. It wasn't cool to be like the Black kid from Queens who wore a baseball cap. You sort of like were, if you did achieve any level of success, you were successful in spite of, that background. And it was almost like a novelty, like, the funny, girl with the last name who comes from the place, but she's so chic, she wears her grandmother's bags. It's funny, it was that type of a conversation around it instead of really celebrating our differences. So it has changed a lot. It has not changed enough. I'm still frequently the only person of color in rooms with decision makers, and that's really challenging. I don't see that changing fast enough. I think we do a lot of talking about how much changes we've made, and fashion as an industry likes to really pat itself on the back, but in fact, like, not so great. You know, you still have to have a lot of really challenging conversations. You still have to bite your tongue a lot. You still have to sort of grin and bear it and, you know, move at a pace that's comfortable to your white counterparts. And, you know, that I found that to be quite frustrating, but we are making some progress. Yeah.
I agree. I feel like sometimes there's conversations you can have with your peers and your own team, and it feels like there's so much progress going on. And then you have to go into a big company and have a meeting, and then again, you're othered and you're the only one in the room. Ben, when you were starting out, how did you have to, well, after your career in basketball, when you were starting with Byredo, I guess with your own business, it can be slightly different, but you know, were you having conversations where you felt like you were the only person in the room that was of a different background? And if you did, like, how did you navigate those?
Definitely. I think it initially started, you know, when I raised capital, the wealth was concentrated, you know, in one place. And this was true for America, and this was true for Europe. So I was thrown into this, to these rooms. But that room was, to be honest, was not that different from any other room I'd been in as a kid. When I grew up in Sweden, you know, in the 80s, you know, we'd get chased by neo-Nazis. You know, I had an experience around racism, which was in Sweden was grouping all immigrants into one group of people, and then there was a native, you know, multi-generational Swedish identity, and it was really us and them. So I dealt with a certain form, and then, you know, moving to Canada, which was, you know, a very young country and very multicultural, and then growing up in, you know, in a Caribbean community, and then finally interacting, you know, for the first time in my life with a larger Indian community. I started, you know, I had another experience about how race and culture, how it relates to you know, the socioeconomic world, and then moving to America, you know, I had a completely different experience, which was very blatant, a very blatant form of racism, and a very segregated experience. So I've learned to deal with a certain form of racism that exists, or presumed racism. So as I've stepped into these rooms, and then at the same time, you know, I'm not as dark as my mother. I even, you know, I even pass as white in certain rooms. It's really it's a really very different experience for me that's constantly kind of evolving. So I took a natural kind of step back and just understood relatively early that people are going to judge me for 100 different things, and that I need to be, as I was in sports, you know, I need to be laser focused. And I think with I realized that it was very much about my ability and my competencies and my craft, that those were going to be the things that convinced people. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've also grown a level of confidence in not only the company and my ability, but also in our community and friends that are excelling, and to the point where I need to care less and less about it. And that's, you know, empowering in a way, that when I look at the industry, and I do believe it's going in the right directions, and probably, unfortunately, probably for the wrong reasons. So I think what's lagging is that the changes that are happening are somehow a result of a public opinion, and not maybe internal change of mindsets. So I think that next kind of phase is very much about getting people to actually believe in the change for the right reasons. It was odd to me that all of a sudden I became a person of color that people reached out to because they needed a certain affirmation or they needed to understand. And I found that very fear-based at the time when it was reaching an apex. And I found that also quite troubling.
Beyond us all being creatives, like this is a business that makes money, and there's definitely a disparity between the haves and have nots, like when it comes to raising capital, when it comes to those decisions. So I can only imagine, even outside of us, how many people have had those difficult conversations. And also something I want to touch on is that everywhere that you've lived and you've listed, America seems to have been the place that you have made to feel the most uncomfortable. But in all those different communities, you faced racism and discrimination. And it also then leads on to this idea that Susie touched on earlier, that navigating all of this is already difficult, but then there's this idea that we all have to work twice as hard as our counterparts to even get half of where we're going. And maybe that's good, because at least we know at the end of the day we're extremely talented people, but that can take its toll on you, right? Like it's always like you're working so hard and navigating these conversations. So Sam, has there been any conversations, or I mean, you don't have to give specifics, you can if you want, but like, have there been any, experiences that you're comfortable to talk about that have been, I guess, defining for you, and how did you navigate that?
Spent a lot of my time growing up outside of London. So I've had my head all kicking by all types of skinheads. And again, when I went to secondary school, there were like 3 black people out of 250 people in the year. And one of them was my cousin. So there's been like that immediate type of ostracization, which has kind of occurred. And you kind of, unfortunately, it becomes the norm to have to kind of either combat that and kick back against it, or find ways around it through like vocabulary, or kind of trying to signal to some type of like code or class to then erode any type of discrimination which could actually present itself. Because again, in this country, so much of it is based on class as well as it is race, and class is almost more determinant. And I've seen that be an issue for peers of mine who I kind of studied with, even before I really get into industry. And there have been extreme cases, early on in fashion, where I've been, sat at a dinner table in Milan, and someone's dropping the word nigger, and it's been a big deal. And this is like on a corporate front. I'm not going to out what company it was, but it has happened, and these things do happen, and we all know the relationship that Milan has in terms of dealing with race, which can be quite difficult. On the other front, unfortunately, that's not necessarily, that's one instance, but it's not necessarily a random occurrence. And I think that I'd like to speak about the fact that in reality, because we are such a minority, and because of the storied history of imperialism and colonialism, that is always going to be a constant battle or soft war that is at hand at all times. I guess I tried to not go into the glossy side of the industry. When I decided to move into fashion, I was like, where are the people who look like me? And there weren't really many in the UK that looked like me or had a similar story that resonated. So I started researching, well, who abroad is doing what I'd like to be doing, or have some type of, overlap. And of course it was, I have to just say this because it is completely the truth, the kids and the excellent talents that were coming from New York and LA and Chicago, these are the people that actually showed me personally that there was another way to exist in the industry, where you didn't necessarily have to feel like you'd have to put, your tail between your legs to move forward or whatnot. So at that point, it was more so looking towards opportunity abroad that enabled me to feel maybe a bit more comfortable and secure in the industry. And even at that point, it's still an ongoing thing where, again, only like you could say domestic dialogues are only now allowed to kind of be on the forefront, which is brilliant. But in terms of discrimination in industry, it's part of the reason why I decided to start my own business and hire, majority POC and have a better ratio of mixed ethnicities and genders working in the company, because we can engage with these larger conglomerates, but you're not going to see change in these companies until Gen Y comes up. Do you know what I mean? And they're like, you know, still 11 to 15-year-olds who we really need to be concentrating on. What we can do though is, of course, continue to cultivate and build our own teams to build up a microcosm of change. So I'm less interested on have I been discriminated against, because I've always been discriminated against. All of us have here, right? I'm more interested in what type of you could say micro change can we bring, and what type of companies can we foster to help the younger Gen Z and the kids who are Gen Y not have to move into these majority, you know, right-wing spaces, because it's not just about race here; it's also about the, you know, the politics are also, you know, heavily part of the problem, you could say.
Fashion is still part of our society that was built on colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. So we're obviously just going to be a fallout from that. And I feel I resonate with you, Sam, about starting your own business and being able to like hire peers, or not necessarily friendship peers, but really thinking about your diverse team and your storytelling. But everyone else that has been, and I guess this is a question for Susie and Carlos, like, as you've worked in different magazines and things, how have you felt comfortable to have conversations with this around your peers, or is this something that's only been happening recently?
To be honest, the kind of conversations that I've had in the last 6 months have been far more illuminating and rewarding than any that I've had before. Because before it was more like I found a community, and you know, there were things that I could speak about with people that are of ESCA origin, that's East and Southeast Asian. There was no way I could verbalize a lot of it with white peers or colleagues. Like it was oftentimes like a kind of, you know, if I felt uncomfortable, say, like about the way certain cultures are depicted in like editorials, for instance, or I just remember like someone like making fun of, I don't know, a Korean model's name because to them they all sounded quite similar, and just things like that. I found it really difficult to like kind of have the you know, to speak up and say, actually, that's not cool, you know, like, because that's just something ingrained in me, and I'm not someone that likes like open confrontation.
I also feel that that's really another thing I find, is that why must the people that aren't white be the ones that have to say something anyway? You know, these conversations and these negative comments aren't only said to you or in front of you.
There's a different cultural aspect to this where you know, another sort of generalization, a broad stroke generalization, is that in our cultures, you know, we're taught to be like quite silent and non-vocal about grievances, and that does carry through into the professional sphere. So I have had this sort of back and forth feeling of like, well, if I didn't speak up, well, how do I expect people to be aware or be understanding? And so I
don't think that conversation was really like, I think Sue's like, you'll understand, like, we didn't have the language prior to a year and a half ago, but I also don't think we had
the courage,
consciousness of the people. You know, there wasn't a space really, we weren't existing in a space where people were ready to receive certain truths, certainly not from us. And I think that we were sort of made to feel that, you know, the higher we climbed and the more successful we became, and the less we sort of saw people that looked like us. And when we did, maybe we understood that they had to they had to accept a lot of things in order to achieve that success, and look the other way a lot. And I think what's happened in the past year and a half, and all of this information being so readily available to people, and there's been this incredible sort of collective shift of consciousness. And I think people are being forced to listen to certain conversations. I do feel as though, you know, a lot of those conversations people would rather not be having them, especially, you know, in public forums. But now that the floodgates have opened and we have, you know, I think as a group of like-minded people, we've decided that actually we're not going to tolerate certain things anymore. We're not going to be silenced anymore. And, you know, just because we're fashion people doesn't mean that we can't stand up for what's right or what's wrong. I think that has been the biggest change. You know, I think that even I didn't even realize that certain things that were happening were, you know, inappropriate. And I certainly never truly understood my relationship or, you know, how much I've benefited from my proximity to white supremacy. And
there's a gratitude element though that is like, so, you know, it's like this thing where we're so, I don't know, you go through this process of being so grateful to be allowed in the space and allowed in the room and just be present. And so then you end up almost, I don't know, in your head, like kind of dismissing or minimizing certain things for the sake of just being able to be in that space.
I can definitely resonate with that. And I think with my own background, I'm Indian and Nigerian. And actually, I find that both families' relationship with racism or reaction to it is quite different. I find that like in my Indian side, everyone's much more passive and wants to just like ignore it almost or pretend it's not happening. This is in my personal family. In my Nigerian side, it's much more like, you know, we're ready to speak, ready to say something that like, you know, much more vocalized about it. And I guess there's definitely this thing, and I feel like growing up that you don't want to rock the apple cart, and you don't want to like cause a disturbance because you're, you know, quote unquote lucky to be there. I think that we need to start thinking that actually everyone in those rooms are lucky to have us there, because we're all, you know, all of you are obviously amazing. So they're really lucky to be holding court with you anyway. All of this is like stuff that is on our shoulders that isn't on our white counterparts' shoulders, you know, thinking about, can you speak up in these conversations? Are you rocking the apple cart? And do you feel, I mean, all of you are so successful in your own rights, but do you feel like there's been a professional impact from being a person of color? Like, do you feel that there's been times where things haven't happened for you because of where you're from? Or do you feel like you've done it all in spite of that?
I started on my own properly 4 years ago. And it was really at a time when there was this, you just felt the shift happening, right? In terms of who got to say what and how they got to say it. I think the way that people were receiving fashion was shifting. I think the people that were sort of at the forefront was shifting. There was this big Black energy just coming, you know, in music, in fashion, in art, you know, and it included Virgil and Shane and Kanye and Rocky and this crowd of people who invaded fashion all at once. And suddenly you're at, you know, Paris Fashion Week and you're like, fuck, is this like a hip hop concert? Is this like a fashion show? Like, what's going on? And so I was really lucky to be starting out around that time. And I do think that that's when the sort of hunger for Black voices and sort of alternative points of view was really starting to rev up. And my mother and I have this ongoing conversation about when she was starting out in the workplace, and affirmative action was sort of a very big thing in the States. And for those of you who don't know, affirmative action is when there's a certain amount of positions that are allocated in large companies to Black people so that there's diversity. That was a big, big scandal. My mother is also a very overachiever. She felt that she didn't need affirmative action. She didn't understand it when she first started in the workplace. Now she obviously does. And so with those sort of thoughts in mind, I always thought to myself, I don't want to be looked at as like receiving, you know, opportunities because I'm Black. But I think what I've had to learn is that I'm just as good and just as talented and just as knowledgeable as my white counterparts. And so, you know, if what gave me the edge is my background, whether that's my race or, you know, the way that I look at fashion or the way that I work, then that's okay. And it's not because I'm Black that I got a job. And even if it is, then that's okay too. So it's like less for me about the money. It's like really about representation and about being the person in the space to be able to say, actually, guys, hold on. That's not okay. We can't do it like that. We can't say it like that. There needs to be more of us. So it's really about that for me.
Yeah, and role models definitely lead to self-confidence and people feeling like they would be able to imagine themselves in a situation in that kind of life. What about you, Ben? How do you feel like it's impacted you? You know, is there definite positives from your background or definite negatives? How have you managed to navigate that?
I think, lately it's been quite positive, I think, because of this forced hand. Most of my career, or since founding this company, 15 years ago, it was quite different. I think people like Virgil and people like Samuel, there are friends that have collectively contributed to a big shift, and I think I still believe that social media is by far the most important kind of variable in this equation. I think it's that voice that equated to power. I think that forced the hand, but I do think that the role models are extremely important, because I didn't understand what fashion was as an industry until 15 years ago. I started with nothing. Technically I was homeless when I started this company. There were many years of just where the thesis was that I have to get into the inside of an industry to be able to change it. So I think there was I had a different approach to building a company then than I think people need to have today. And I think there's probably more responsibility on me as my career in this company evolves. Is that we start to help people on their journeys in a much more linear way, and not this apologetic navigation in and out of rooms to make sure that we could move forward. And I think that's the big the big positive change, is that you can, as yourself, as a person of color, you can step into the forefront of an idea or a product, and you can pioneer it in a much more linear way.
I have to say, as someone that, like, I started my brand only 3 years ago now, and it feels longer, but it's not. And I feel like I have to always give thanks to the people that were in the generation before me, because even me growing up, and I'm in the generation that's coming up now, like, there was no Black or South Asian female fashion designers. I didn't see any, unless if I looked at Nigeria Fashion Week or Indian Fashion Week. And so I definitely feel so grateful to the people that have come before, but I feel like it's still only quite new. In London now, it's getting really good. And I think what we also have to recognize, and what I love to keep sort of highlighting, is that not only am I a fashion designer, but I'm a business owner. And with that, there's power in that. I'm able to employ people from different backgrounds, employ people that look like me, choose collaborators that, from different areas. And I really do think that feeds into creativity. So how do you guys navigate, choosing your teams or working with your teams? Do you feel like it's important to highlight or amplify people from different backgrounds? I know, Sam, you did your amazing, I was so literally got goosebumps even thinking about your mentorship program when you raised that fund. And so how important is, who did you work with on that, and how important is choosing your team for you? So Sam,
I think it's super important. I think that to kind of carry the culture of a founder or company, you need a whole team who understand and resonate with that culture. For that, I guess, point of communication to be clear and succinct, and the cadence of the company and the brand to kind of come forth. So when the Cold War started, I mean, I just employed the hood, to be honest. The first 14, 12, 13 people were all from like North London, East London, Brixton, because that culture was the brand and is the brand. I wasn't really interested in kind of emulating counterculture and then selling it to people. It was always about making sure it's come from, it's come from the sandbox versus it being a white hand or, some type of corporate hand looking into the sandbox and taking what they want. And again, we kind of took everyone with us to Paris Fashion Week. There are still videos of our first showrooms on social media going viral of like the man them rocking about, having fun, fighting. All of that culture cannot be emulated, and it's incredibly important that it exists. And again, as you were saying, Priya, and as Ben was saying, being like a business owner enables you to kind of give your community opportunities and allow the people who want to mature with it to mature. And again, not everyone is going to want to stay on that path and move into more of like a fixed career, but there are exceptional people who deserve the shot to be in the room and then grow. Some of the earliest employees of a Cold War are now marketing directors for the company on earning what they should be earning without being penalized because of a particular background they came from. Some have gone on to do MBAs now and are partners. For me, it's always about having the company and being creative and bringing those two together. The company element allows you to facilitate, existential growth for the entire group versus just, being a creative at times. It can sometimes just be about the individual and the vision. That's nice, but I'm more interested at this point at facilitating the growth of more people. And onto the point of the first wave of grants, it just felt like, again, a conversation which doesn't get had about when you do start to have a salary that falls into top 1% of society or top 0.5%, what are you going to do with that take home and cash? Because a lot of the time there's a lot of gaslighting on the front end of, we're for everyone, yada, 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 but no one's actually putting up the resources or funds to facilitate the next generation or people from our community or marginalized people to actually have the opportunity to move forward. So I felt like the best thing to do was actually put up resources for exceptional individuals who had brilliant businesses or, creative practices who just needed to be highlighted and needed that extra step. But I remember starting a Cold War, I didn't get BFC until it was like 2.5 years in. And again, to be completely honest, that's 2.5 years too late. We were already global brand by that point, to be completely frank. So it's how do you help people when they really need that step forward? And there's another grant series that we're working on to release in the next 3 to 4 weeks, which will be more so about, again, like highlighting and finding exceptional talents, allotting them with funds, but also making sure that they're introduced to the right people within the industry so that they can have a career, not just a moment on the back of a response. And what we did prior was good and it was for the right intentions. But again, as Ben was saying, we need to move away from responding to trauma and responding to issues and actually start building, healing through economics into the midterm and long-term plan, which should happen even when we're not seeing someone's neck getting stamped on. It needs to be happening all the time,
Yeah.
This grant system is moving forward.
It's so true. And I think it speaks to the idea that the problems and the issues that we're facing as an industry are systemic. And so, putting a Band-Aid over it is never going to help. Leading on from that, Ben, what do you feel like the changes that you want to see? I sometimes I worry, I don't know, personally about these questions, because I feel like as people that are from minority backgrounds, I'm sometimes thinking, why are you asking me? Because I can't change anything. I don't know. I sometimes get a bit like, ask the people that can make the change. But if you could speak to everyone and they were going to listen to you, what would you say? I know I definitely agree with Sam. It comes from the economics as well as just getting a foot in the door. But what would you like to see as the changes in industry-wide moving forward in terms of in relation to race?
I really respect, what Samuel's done in such an early part of his career in terms of building a brand that was integrating, a certain level of social responsibility from its, I failed at doing that the first years of building this company because I didn't understand it's possible. I really thought that I had to get to a certain point and then start doing good. So it's a great, inspiration to see people build brands, for block in the right way. And I think because of a system and because of hundreds and hundreds of years of certain things being a certain way, if you take your eye off the ball, even your backyard gets dirty, and so it is really a constant kind of work that needs to be focused on. We have to also get into steering young people in directions in terms of possibilities, because even though I sat with my HRs and revised their strategies and changed, their approach to certain things, talent pools were difficult in certain cities. And when I was asking big design agencies, I've been working with you for 5 years, why don't you have any people of color in your office? And they would say, they're just not enough coming out of school. There was a certain level of truth in that. So, and when they asked what they should do about that, I said, well, you should invest in mentorship programs early enough so that young people of color actually want to go to school for graphic design. I think it's very much about possibilities and opening up the mind.
That's totally true. Just to jump in there, I think that's completely true. And again, this is something we've also started to not struggle with, but you have to spend way more time on it. Again, when the company is, incubation phase, it's your own money, there's no seed or A series that's occurred yet, it's still very grassroots. It's a lot easier to be able to integrate your local community and people who understand the softer elements of running the business and communicating the business. We've even found now, as the company starts to really scale and go into those throes of like growing globally, there are less and less faces of color to employ at the levels you want to employ people at. Because the problem is you can start to have a marginalization within the workplace where everyone at a junior or entry or placement is of color, and the further up you go in the ranks, it's harder to find people of color who you resonate with, who are fundamentally qualified to be in that role. So let's say, global marketing director across 2 territories, responsible for £3 million of revenue. And I think to get to the point on this, we need to start working, or at least pushing on academia, and we need to start pushing on privatized companies and bigger companies to make sure that they're actually building programs, or at least starting to communicate outside of just commerce, so that people of color can become more than consumers and entry-level jobs fundamentally. Because again, with my experience, if it wasn't for my household, which is a very particular household of like building pinhole cameras with my father, and him going and doing an MA degree in industrial design, and then me saying I want to do design at 13, if you don't have that, which a lot of people don't from marginalized backgrounds, how do you get to that next level? And it's all about that Gen Y and that younger generation.
As well as it being, it's going to be a time thing. I also think, speaking to Susie's point at the very beginning of the conversation, when you're from a background, like a background that isn't white British in the UK or white American, and you've come from a migrant background, your families, I mean, I experienced it in my family. I know some of my team that are in the room around me have experienced it in their family. Like, they push back on creative subjects because actually they are literally worried for you, thinking you need to work twice as hard to have some sort of enjoyment. And so I don't even think within families, Black, Brown, East Asian people are even necessarily encouraged to go into the creatives, because it doesn't seem like a safe career choice. So I hope by like all of us here and all of our amazing peers, like we've mentioned some great ones in this conversation, I hope that this generation of us creatives can allow that the next one, their parents aren't so worried because they can see some of us doing great things. So Susie, to ask you the same bigger conversation, in an ideal and dream world, and this again doesn't fall, the responsibility shouldn't be on your shoulders, but what would you like to see change and improve, or what systemic changes would you like to see for a better industry?
We are talking about like a generational change, but also like a sort of a phasing out of a whole generation that are like still very much there, you know, like, so, you know, for instance, when that whole Michelle Galbert incident kind of blew up and everything, and I thought, actually, you know, this is maybe an opportunity to have that kind of conversation that, you know, because he's a different generation, it's like the older generation, really super well respected, and to have a dialogue to come from a personal level, like beyond like performative action in a corporate level where you put out a statement, nothing gets done, the statement is there, it's like it becomes like a sort of gesture, like an empty one, but not backed by actual, because nobody is like going like behind the scenes and saying, but who are you hiring, who are you, you know, what actual change are you actually, you know, pushing forward, you know, as that New York Times report evidence, you know, nothing has actually really happened since Black Lives Matter. So I'm trying to come at it maybe, and right now, together with a kind of organization that I loosely affiliated, ESCA Sisters, which is, you know, a group of amazing ESCA, mostly women based in the UK in the creative industries. We're trying to maybe like shift away from just cancel culture and have actual dialogue that maybe changes, even if it changes just one person's views or attitudes, can they then take that into their workplace? So to that end, I'm trying to have that dialogue with, for instance, Michelle Galbert, and in private level that we may also publish further down the line as well. So for me, it's about tackling it at a more interpersonal level.
You know, ignorance is not bliss. So I totally see, you know, the power in being able to slowly, I mean, I know I use my Instagram story to tell people things all the time. So I know that if we can try and change some certain mindsets, hopefully we'll be able to build and be collective. So before I ask my sort of final question, Carlos, what about you? What do you feel, you know, what would be the ideal things for you to see to change? I'm sure Susie, Ben and Sam have said stuff that you definitely resonate with, but have you got anything else to add?
The most important thing, I think, is ushering in a new generation of people who are forward thinking, who live in a vortex where things that are trivial, like class and race and sex and sexuality and gender identity, like those things don't really matter, so that we can get back to the point of really actually tending to the real issues in the world. I think those issues are too numerous to mention. Like, we don't even have enough time in the day, right? But I think for starters, we need to start filling these spaces with people who are actually looking to change. Because as everyone has stated, too often we're surrounded by people who want to look as though they're doing the right thing. But when it comes down to it, like, I'm sure Michelle, if you would have asked him what he thought about Black Lives Matters or Stop Asian Hate, would have said the perfect thing. You know, he would have said, you know, everything that everyone else says. But behind closed doors, like, why was that even funny? Do you know what I mean? Like, to me, it's just like, why would like a grown person actually spend their time doing something like that in 2021 when all of these conversations are going on around us? It's very disheartening, you know, and it just makes you think, like, are you guys actually listening? And so for me, that's the biggest thing. It's like, let's stop the bullshit. Let's stop pretending, you know, let's stop like acting like you care if you don't. And let's like really fill these spaces with people who do care and like do want to make a change, and let's really start to move on and start to heal. And I think start to listen properly to one another.
I think that smaller businesses like, you know, like mine or Sam's, well, Sam's is not small, but, you know, businesses that are newer in terms of years have the agility to be able to change and be able to pick, you know, I feel like a positive of my brand is I can be really agile and I can literally change my mind about something in one day and no one else can tell me anything. I think what the bigger companies, you're totally right, they need to start having people that actually care. You know, I have had experiences recently where big companies want to work with me and I go there and I walk in the room and there is not one person that looks like me. And it's like, why am I the one that has to say this? Like, why am I the one telling your marketing team or asking to look at your diversity policy and saying like it's one sheet of paper and it looks pretty shit? You know, I think that it's totally right. We do need more people that care, and I don't know how we're going to change it from this conversation, but I hope some people listen and they do some good things. But I want to finish on, you know, all of us have said how important we think the future is and the future generation, and I want to finish on, I guess, a positive note. So I would say, what would your advice be to any new Black, ethnic minority, South Asian, East Asian, LGBTQI creatives, or even non-creatives, but people that want to come into this industry? What would your advice be to them? And also to have a joyful experience. I think that so much of this is hard, and I feel like actually we're creatives and we should at some point have joy in the day. So what advice would you give?
We are still a vast minority in the industry and even in the global sense, and that, you know, with that comes also kind of a unique perspective. And I would just, you know, I really try to tell young people to believe in their perspective, you know, believe in their story, believe in their perspective, and maintain that level of authenticity as they push through, because it's been something that's worked for me, and it's brought me to a place where I'm proud to say that I've been able to get there while, you know, maintaining a certain level of integrity, and I think that's extremely important as people kind of embark on these journeys.
I think now is actually like kind of an amazing time to come in and create your space. Like, I mean, I know I talked about creating my space and that was like 15 years ago, but now you have like a myriad of platforms and a myriad of ways of actually creating your own space, like quite literally, and being heard at like a real amplified volume as well. Like, you know, whether it's as a brand, as a photographer, as a writer, whatever it is, I feel like now is the time to actually speak your truth, as Carlos said, and actually for that truth to resonate with people, because people, like, let's say the public at large, you know, they are seeing through a lot of things that are systemic in our industry, and they're calling that out and they are asking for better. And so it's actually up to like this new generation to come in and give them better.
Individuals coming up in like the next generation, it doesn't have to be like a lone walk. It can be really beneficial to find and just share ideas with like-minded people. If that can be achieved, then they have a movement on their hands. If there's a movement on your hands, things move forward a lot quicker, and people will really change their ideologies and views, and new, I guess, just ways of creative business or operating can come about quicker. It doesn't need to be a lone journey. It can be shared with peers.
I would say to people starting out that there is space for you, even if it feels like maybe there's not, no matter how sort of niche your skill set is, there is space for you. I think we're working in this sort of rapidly changing field, and we are really lucky, I think, to get to be the generation that can redefine and sort of redesign what this industry is.
I think I'm just going to sort of echo all of your thoughts, and I would say just to believe in yourself and to believe in your story, and also be proud of it. And
right.
Yeah, mix in some hard work as well. I think that's always good. So I just want to say thank you to all of you. It's been a great discussion. I feel like, well, I guess, yeah, I feel like we've covered so many topics. I've learned so much from all of you, so I really appreciate it. And I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us here.